At the time this happened, I was 19, almost 20, and my ex-boyfriend Gavin was 27. We lived together in a 3-bedroom house with our pets, his big Chow Chow, Ollie, and my cat Sterling. A few months before, we had let a friend, Lacey, stay with us, but she took advantage of our kindness, so we had to ask her to leave. The week before the attack, Gavin had just come home from a long work trip. He had been gone for about 3 or 4 weeks, but when he got back, he wasn't himself. He seemed out of it, lost in his own world. I'd ask him to do something simple, like take out the trash, and 5 minutes later he'd act like I never said anything. It was frustrating, and no matter what I did, I couldn't get through to him. One day he told me that if he kept acting like this, I should slap him to snap him out of it. It was a weird thing to say, but I shrugged it off. A couple of days before everything happened, we went out to dinner with his mom, and she could tell something was wrong too. She was really worried. As far as I knew, the only mental health issue Gavin had was OCD, but looking back, I don't think that was the whole story. On the day of the attack, we picked up some takeout and sat in the living room. I was painting my nails, and Gavin was playing Mario Kart. Out of nowhere, he looked at me and said, "Lacey put a curse on my family." I didn't know how to respond. I was struggling with my own mental health at the time. I have BPD, and I wasn't in the right headspace to deal with whatever was happening to him. Trying to help, I suggested he take a cold shower since it had helped him calm down earlier that week. He got up and walked to the bathroom, mumbling to himself. The way he was acting gave me a bad feeling, like something terrible was about to happen. I followed him and gently asked if I could call his mom, maybe invite her over for dinner. I didn't want to say it outright, but I was hoping she could come and help. The moment I suggested it, he snapped. He started yelling, saying all he needed was me. I backed away and went to the living room, dialing his mom. Suddenly, he came storming out of the bathroom, completely naked, shouting at Ollie, trying to get him to attack me. But Ollie was my dog too, and he refused. At this point, Gavin's mom had answered the call, and she could hear what was going on. Then he did something that terrified me. He started calling me Lacey instead of my real name, screaming that I had to pay for what I did. I panicked and ran to the bedroom, locking the door behind me while still on the phone with his mom. But it didn't matter. He kicked the door open like it was nothing. Before I could react, he grabbed me, slammed my head into the mirrored closet doors, and threw my phone to the floor. He was screaming that he was going to kill me. I knew I had to get out of that house. I scrambled out of the room, trying to make it to the front door, but as I passed the kitchen, he caught me. Wrapping his arms around my neck, he started choking me. I couldn't breathe. My vision was going dark. I glanced at the table and saw Sterling, my cat, with his fur puffed up, staring at us in fear. That's when I realized I might actually die. Then Gavin said something that sent a chill down my spine. He asked if I knew what it felt like to have horrible things done to me. A year before this, I had been assaulted, and I had told him about it. But now I wasn't sure if he was even aware of what he was saying or if he was lost in some nightmare in his head. He threw me to the ground and lifted his foot over my head like he was about to stomp on it. That was the first time I saw his eyes during the attack. They looked empty. His pupils were so big that you could barely see any color in them. He kept shouting, "Admit it, Lacey, you know what you did, admit it." I had no idea what he was talking about, but I knew I had to do whatever it took to survive. I started apologizing, saying whatever I could to calm him down. It worked, just for a second. That was all I needed. I jumped up and ran for the door, but I forgot to leave the screen door open. That small delay could have cost me everything. Ran outside barefoot in the freezing Canadian winter, knocking on doors, begging for help. Then I heard a sound I will never forget. Ollie screaming. I knew Gavin was killing him. I collapsed on the ground, sobbing, "Gavin, leave him alone." But I already knew it was too late. Neighbors started coming out of their houses. An older couple saw me and rushed to help. They brought me inside and called the police. Someone handed me a phone, and I called my mom. She was out at dinner with friends. The moment she answered, all I could say was, "Gavin killed the dog and tried to kill me." The police arrived with several cars, guns drawn. They ordered him to come out with his hands up. He walked out, still naked, covered in blood. An officer came over and asked how many pets I had. When I told them about Ollie and Sterling, they looked at me and said, "The dog is dead." Gavin had killed Ollie in the living room, then carried him to the bathtub. I was in shock, but my mind kept going back to one thing: Sterling. I begged the officers to find my cat. They searched the house and found him hiding, terrified and lashing out at anyone who got near. They asked me to go in and get him. The house smelled like blood and fear. When I saw Sterling curled up on the bed crying, I scooped him up and held him tight. As I walked outside, Gavin's mom had just arrived. She looked at me and asked, "Where's Ollie?" I couldn't sugarcoat it. Gavin killed him. She dropped to the ground, sobbing. 2 weeks later, Sterling and I were on a plane to my mom's trying to escape the nightmare. The court case took over 2 years. During that time, I found out something even more terrifying. Gavin had loaded our guns that night. I don't even want to think about what could have happened. I also learned how he killed Ollie. I never wanted to know. But one of the officers mentioned a baseball bat before realizing I hadn't been told. And after all of that, Gavin only got 10 months of house arrest. Even now, 2 years later, he still tries to contact me. He blames me for not getting him help sooner. And the worst part? A tiny part of me believes him. This happened when I stepped out of the car, my shoes crunching against the cracked pavement of Blackwood's empty main street. The town looked like something out of an old, forgotten photograph, faded, worn, and completely lifeless. Buildings stood with peeling paint and broken windows, their shadows stretching long in the dim evening light. The air smelled damp, mixed with the faint, sour scent of decay. I swallowed hard, already feeling the weight of this place settle in my chest. I wasn't here by choice, not really. As a psychologist, I spent years helping other people sort through their pain, but after everything that happened, I couldn't even face my own reflection. Losing Claire in that crash shattered me. Grief stuck to me like a second skin, heavy and suffocating. My colleagues told me I needed a break, time away from the memories. So here I was, in a town where the silence felt just as broken as I was. Jack, the driver who brought me here, hauled my bags out of the trunk. He was an older guy, rough around the edges but friendly enough. He eyed the rundown buildings and let out a low whistle. "You sure this is where you want to be, Doc?" he asked, rubbing the back of his neck. Not exactly the warmest welcome. I forced a small smile. "I'll be fine, Jack. I need the quiet." He didn't look convinced, but he gave me a nod before getting back in his car. As he drove off, I stood alone, the silence pressing in like a thick fog. The warm summer air should have been comforting, but instead, it made my skin prickle. The trees surrounding the town loomed overhead, their branches tangled together like bony fingers reaching toward the sky. Taking a deep breath, I turned to face my new home, a towering, rusted old Victorian house. The place was massive, its once grand design now crumbling with age. The windows were dark and empty, like hollow eyes staring straight through me. A shiver ran down my spine, but I shook it off and stepped forward. The front door groaned as I pushed it open, revealing the stale, dust-filled air inside. The scent of rot was stronger here, thick enough to make me cough. Cobwebs clung to the chandeliers and the wooden floorboards let out soft creaks under my feet. The whole house felt off, like it had been waiting for someone. As I wandered through the dimly lit halls, an unsettling feeling crept up my spine. It started as a tiny prickle at the back of my neck, then grew into something heavier, something I couldn't ignore. It felt like I was being watched. At first, I brushed it off, just my imagination, right? But the feeling wouldn't go away. Every step I took echoed through the house, and with each creak, I swore I could hear something just behind me. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow, dark, shapeless, moving along the edge of my vision. My breath caught in my throat. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the empty hallway stretching in front of me. The lights flickered. Once, then again, and then darkness. My heart pounded. The silence around me wasn't empty anymore. It was full of something unseen, something waiting, and for the first time since I arrived, I knew I wasn't alone in Blackwood. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers shaking as I tried to turn on the flashlight. The darkness around me felt suffocating, thick with the smell of damp wood and decay. My breath came in quick, uneven gasps, and no matter how much I told myself to move, my feet wouldn't budge. The house was silent. Too silent. Each cautious step I took made the floorboards groan beneath me, the sound stretching down the empty halls like a warning. And then that feeling hit me again. The prickling sensation at the back of my neck, the unmistakable weight of unseen eyes watching my every move. A whisper. Soft. Raspy. Right by my ear. "Welcome home, James." I froze. My stomach twisted. The words weren't loud, but they echoed off the walls, wrapping around me like a cold breath. Spun around, my phone's light slicing through the darkness. No one was there. Nothing but dust and empty space, but the voice, it hadn't come from a person. It had come from the house itself. Swallowing my fear, I forced myself to move forward. I had to understand what was happening here. My phone's dim glow threw long, eerie shadows on the peeling wallpaper as I stepped into a room that looked untouched for decades. Dust coated the furniture like a thick layer of snow, and cobwebs stretched from the ceiling like ghostly fingers. Then I saw it, a portrait hanging on the far wall, a family frozen in time. Their expressions were solemn, their dark eyes staring forward. But something wasn't right. The longer I looked, the more the shadows around them seemed to shift, stretching, twisting, moving on their own. My skin prickled with unease. These weren't just ordinary shadows. They were alive. The whisper returned, louder this time, urgent and insistent. "Find the key, James. Unlock the secrets." My heart pounded as I realized the voice was coming from the portrait itself. The family's eyes followed me as I stepped closer, their expressions almost expectant. This house wasn't just old, it wasn't just haunted, it was waiting for me, and I had just stepped into something far worse than I could have ever imagined. My eyes stayed locked on the portrait, my mind racing. Who were these people? What were they hiding behind those frozen, almost knowing smiles? The whispers seemed to slither through the darkness, urging me to dig deeper, to uncover the truth buried within these walls. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye, a small, nearly invisible compartment behind the frame. My fingers trembled as I pried it open, revealing a dust-covered journal. The name scrawled inside sent a chill down my spine. Elizabeth. Flipping through the brittle pages, I found entries that spoke of something beyond reality, an unseen realm, where shadows weren't just empty spaces but living, breathing entities. They moved, they whispered, and worst of all, they watched. Elizabeth wrote of a presence lurking within the darkness, something ancient and hungry. It wanted more than just fear. It craved souls. The journal detailed strange rituals, cryptic warnings, and a darkness waiting patiently to be set free. Then I reached the final entry. Elizabeth was gone. No explanation, no goodbyes. Just an abrupt end, as if the shadows had swallowed her whole. But they hadn't forgotten. They were still here, waiting. And now they had turned their attention to me. A cold shiver ran through me as my vision blurred. My surroundings twisted, the walls melting into an endless black void. Suddenly, I wasn't in the house anymore. I was somewhere else. Somewhere wrong. A realm of pure darkness stretched around me, shifting like a living thing. The shadows curled and coiled, moving with purpose, watching me from the edges of my vision, and then I saw it. A figure wrapped in shadows standing just ahead. It radiated cold like a winter breeze cutting through bare skin. My breath hitched as an overwhelming sense of dread filled my chest. Then it spoke. "Welcome, James. We've been waiting for you." Its voice was ancient, hollow, carrying the weight of countless stolen souls. "You have something that belongs to us, something that will set us free." I tried to move, to run, but my body refused to obey. The figure reached out, a hand made of pure darkness grazing my skin. The moment it touched me, my vision shattered into nothingness. Then, blackness. I woke up gasping. My room, my bed. The journal still clutched tightly in my hands, but something had changed. The shadows in the room weren't still. They twisted, stretched, breathed, and the whispers. They were louder now, clearer. I knew without a doubt that I had crossed a line. I had stepped into a world where shadows reigned, where they had waited for someone like me, and now they would never let me go. I tried to shake off the creeping unease, telling myself it was just my imagination. But the shadows around me moved, shifting, twisting, almost like they were alive. No matter where I went, I felt it. A presence. Something unseen. Watching. At first, I ignored it. I went through my days, trying to convince myself it was just stress, exhaustion. But then things started happening. Objects weren't where I had left them. Whispers echoed from the walls, coming from nowhere and everywhere all at once. I was losing sleep, losing my grip on reality. This house, this town, it was a waking nightmare. And then came the visions. They hit like flashes of lightning, burning themselves into my mind. I saw myself trapped in endless darkness, my body swallowed by writhing shadows. I felt my soul being pulled apart, my very existence consumed by the presence lurking around me. I needed answers. Desperate, I turned to the journal, flipping through Elizabeth's entries, searching for something, anything that could explain what was happening to me. That's when I found it. The presence wasn't just a ghost or a trick of the mind. It was ancient, something awakened long ago through human rituals. A being of pure darkness, feeding on souls, growing stronger with each victim it claimed. The air in the room thickened as I read. I could feel it growing stronger, as if it knew I had uncovered its secret. I had to leave. Now. I threw clothes into my bag, heart pounding, hands shaking. But as I turned toward the door, I realized I wasn't alone. The shadows had gathered. They stretched across the walls, shifting, blocking every way out. The room grew impossibly dark, swallowing the last slivers of light. I was trapped. I tried to run. My legs refused to move. The air itself seemed to push against me, forcing me to stay. The whispers swelled, no longer distant, no longer subtle. They spoke in voices layered upon voices, all merging into a single overwhelming command. Stay. I should have never taken the shortcut. The thought hit me as soon as I turned onto the narrow alley, my footsteps echoing off the brick walls. I had finished a late shift at the bookstore, and my apartment was only a few blocks away. Normally I stuck to the main roads, well lit and familiar, but exhaustion got the better of me. At first it seemed fine, just an empty passage lined with dumpsters and fire escapes. But as I neared the halfway point, I saw him, a man leaning casually against a graffiti-covered wall smoking. He wasn't blocking my way, but something about him set off every alarm in my head. I kept my pace steady, my hands in my pockets, fingers curling around my keys. He lifted his head as I passed. "Hey," he called out. "Got a light?" I didn't stop, just shook my head and muttered, "Sorry." He chuckled, a low, dry sound. "No problem." But then, just as I was a few steps past him, he added, "You in a hurry?" I ignored him, heart hammering. I could see the street ahead, glowing neon from the diner on the corner. A few more steps and I'd be out of here. Then, he moved. Quick. I felt it more than saw it, his presence shifting behind me. My skin prickled. I didn't dare turn around, but my instinct screamed, "He's following you." 1,000 scenarios raced through my mind. Run? Scream? Turn and act tough? I gritted my teeth and forced myself to stay calm. "Relax," he said. Voice, light but offbeat, like he wasn't used to casual conversation. "You don't have to be weird about it." I spotted an old metal door up ahead, slightly ajar, probably leading to a storage room. If I could just... "You don't think I look like some kind of creep, do you?" The question froze me for a split second. I forced out a shaky laugh. "Nah, man. I just need to get home." He exhaled sharply, like he was disappointed. I reached the door. Without hesitation, I slipped inside and yanked it shut, pressing my back against the cold metal. My breath came out in quick bursts. Silence. Then, his voice muffled through the door. "Suit yourself," he said. A pause, then footsteps slow and retreating. I stayed put for a long time until I was sure he was gone. When I finally stepped back out, the alley was empty. But I didn't linger. I darted onto the main street, the bright lights never looking so welcoming. Never again. No shortcuts, no second chances. The first time I saw real fear in someone else's eyes, I was standing in an alleyway, hands in my pockets, trying not to shake. This wasn't where I was supposed to be. I knew that much. But the rush of the city at night, the neon signs, the faint sound of laughter from bars, the occasional hum of an old radio spilling music onto the street, made it easy to forget what was smart and what was stupid. Dante had convinced me to come. He always did. "It's nothing," he had said earlier that evening. "Just a quick exchange, then we go home." His idea of quick never matched reality, but I had followed anyway, like I always did. We cut through the back streets, taking a shortcut through the industrial district. The factories were quiet this late, leaving only the occasional flicker of an old street lamp or the hiss of steam from a manhole cover. The kind of place that made you feel like the city had forgotten you existed. Dante stopped in front of a rusted metal door. He knocked twice, waited, then knocked 3 more times. A rhythm, a signal. I shifted my weight from one foot to the other, my breath coming out a little too fast. Then the door creaked open. The man who stepped out looked like he hadn't slept in a week. Dark hollows under his eyes, a nervous twitch in his fingers. He looked us over and then turned his head, muttering something to someone inside the building. Dante stepped forward like he belonged there. "We're here for the pickup," he said, his voice smooth, controlled. The man didn't move. Instead, he glanced past Dante and locked eyes with me. That's when I felt it. Something was off. "What's he doing here?" the man asked. Dante chuckled. "Relax, he's with me." "Didn't ask that." The man took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. "I asked why he's here." Dante's confidence wavered just a little. Not enough for most people to notice. But I noticed. "Just back up," Dante said. "Nothing more." The man rubbed his jaw, thinking. Then he whistled. The sound sent a ripple of movement from inside the warehouse. I heard footsteps. More than one set. Someone was shifting things around, the scrape of metal against concrete. Then two figures appeared in the doorway. They weren't nervous like the first guy. They weren't twitchy. They looked calm. Focused, armed, didn't breathe. "You're not supposed to be here," the first man said again, but this time it wasn't a question. It was a statement, a warning. Dante raised his hands, not in surrender but in a slow, measured movement, meant to de-escalate. "Come on, we're just here to make a deal, we don't want trouble." One of the new men laughed under his breath. "You don't want trouble?" He exchanged a look with the other guy. "That's funny." The first man pulled out his phone and made a call. He turned away from us slightly, muttering in low tones I couldn't make out. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips now. A slow, steady pounding. Dante tried again. "We can just leave." The first man held up a finger, silencing him. A long moment passed. Then he put his phone away and turned back to us. "You got two choices," he said. "One, you walk out of here and we pretend we never saw you, but you don't come back. Ever." Dante frowned. "And two?" The man smiled for the first time, but it wasn't friendly. "We make sure you don't walk out at all." The silence that followed was heavier than anything I'd ever felt. Dante's jaw tightened. He wanted to push back, argue, negotiate. But he wasn't stupid. And for once, neither was I. "We're leaving," I said. Dante looked at me, annoyed, but he must have seen the fear on my face, the way my hands were clenched so tight I could barely feel them. He gave a slow nod. "All right," he said. "We're leaving." The men stepped aside, but they didn't turn their backs. They watched us walk. They watched every step. Only when we turned the corner, only when the warehouse was out of sight, did I finally exhale. My hands were still shaking. My stomach still tight. Dante shoved his hands into his pockets and sighed. "Guess we'll have to find a new supplier." I stopped walking, stared at him. "You're kidding, right?" My voice was hoarse, unsteady. Dante just smirked. "What? You think one bad night means we're done?" I turned away from him then. Kept walking, because I already knew the truth. This was the last time I was following Dante anywhere. I had been driving for hours, my truck rumbling along a long, empty road. It was a route I knew well, carrying supplies from one small town to another. Most nights it was just me, the road, and the sound of the engine. I didn't mind the quiet. It gave me time to think. At my last stop, an old roadside station, I got out to stretch and grab some water. The man working there, an older guy with tired eyes, handed me my paperwork and said, "You're the only one out this late." I shrugged. That's how it usually is. He hesitated, looking like he wanted to say something else, but instead, He just gave me a small nod. As I climbed back into my truck, I glanced in the mirror. He was still standing there watching me drive away. I pushed the weird feeling aside and focused on the road ahead. It was dark, and the towns I passed were nothing more than clusters of empty buildings. It was the kind of place where you could drive for miles without seeing another soul. That was normal. But an hour later, I noticed something strange. A tiny flash of light in my side mirror, just for a second. At first, I thought it was a reflection off my truck, maybe from the moon. But when I checked again, I saw something behind me. A car. No headlights. I kept my eyes on the mirror, trying to make sense of it. Who drives that close without lights? I changed lanes to see if they'd pass me. They didn't. I slowed down. So did they. Then, just as suddenly, they disappeared. No turn. No stopping. Just gone. I shook my head, telling myself it was nothing. Maybe I was just tired. A few more hours passed, and exhaustion finally caught up with me. I pulled into a small rest stop, just a dirt patch off the road big enough for a couple of trucks, no buildings, no lights, just a place to park. I turned off the engine, leaned my seat back, and closed my eyes. I woke up to a noise. At first, I wasn't sure what it was. A faint, scraping sound. Slow. Careful. I turned my head, still half asleep, and my heart nearly stopped. Right outside my window, someone was staring in. His face was inches from the glass, eyes wide and unblinking, just watching me. My body froze for a second, my brain struggling to catch up. Then suddenly he reached for the door handle. I jerked back, slamming my hand against the window. He didn't react. Not at first. Then, as if realizing I was awake, he stepped back into the darkness. That's when I saw another figure. Someone else was creeping around the back of my truck. Panic hit me like a punch to the stomach. I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking. The second I got the engine started, I slammed my foot on the gas and tore out of there. In the mirror, I saw them standing in the middle of the road, just watching me go. When I finally reached the next town, I reported what happened. The local officers listened, nodding as I described the two men, but when I mentioned the car that had followed me earlier, one of them shook his head. No other vehicles came through last night, he said. I wanted to argue, to tell them I knew what I saw, but instead I just left. I never saw those men again, but even now when I drive at night, I always check my mirrors just in case. I was 19 when I got a job as a nighttime courier for a medical lab. The pay wasn't great, but I didn't mind. The job was simple: drive around the city, pick up and drop off sealed packages, and enjoy the quiet of the empty roads. It beat working in a noisy restaurant or standing behind a cash register all day. Most nights were uneventful. Just me, my car, and the distant glow of streetlights stretching ahead. But one night, something happened that still makes my skin crawl. It was a Friday, a little after 11, when I got a call from dispatch. My next pickup was at a hospital on the edge of town, a place I'd been to plenty of times before. I drove there, grabbed the package, a heavy, sealed cooler, and headed toward my drop-off location across the city. For the first 15 minutes, everything was normal. The streets were quiet, just the occasional car passing by. Then, as I turned onto a long stretch of road, I noticed a car pull out from a side street behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it. Plenty of cars take this route, I told myself. But after a few more turns, it was still there. Not right up on my bumper, but close enough to feel off. I tried to shake the feeling. Maybe they just happened to be going the same way. But then, I made a turn down a service road. one that only led to industrial buildings and warehouses. There was no reason for anyone else to be back here, yet they followed. A knot tightened in my stomach. I slowed down slightly, hoping they'd pass me, but they didn't. They just matched my speed. My destination was only a few minutes away. I gripped the steering wheel tighter and kept driving. When I finally saw the familiar windowless lab, up ahead, relief washed over me. I turned into the lot, and in my mirror I saw the car keep going straight. I exhaled. Just my imagination. I parked near the back entrance, grabbed the cooler, and started toward the delivery door. The lab was always eerily quiet, just a single security light casting long shadows across the pavement. I pressed the buzzer. Nothing. I hit it again, shifting my weight nervously. Still no answer. Then, movement caught my eye. The car that had been following me was back. It had looped around from another street and was now parked at the far end of the lot. Its headlights were off. My heart pounded. The doors opened. 2 men stepped out. They wore dark hoodies, their faces hidden in the shadows. One of them shoved his hands into his pocket like he was holding something. A chill ran down my spine. I turned back to the buzzer, frantically pressing it again. Come on, open the door. Nothing. The men started walking toward me. I gripped the cooler tighter, my mind racing. My car was just a few steps away. If I ran fast enough, maybe I could. One of them picked up his pace. That was it. I bolted. I sprinted. To my car, my heart slamming against my ribs. I yanked open the door, threw myself inside, and locked it in one motion. My hands shook as I jammed the key into the ignition. Just as the engine roared to life, one of the men reached my window. He smacked his hand against the glass, his face still hidden beneath his hood. I didn't wait to see what he wanted. I threw the car into reverse, tires screeching as I backed up blindly. My bumper slammed into something, but I didn't care. I shifted into drive, stomped on the gas, and sped out of the lot. In my mirror, I saw them sprinting back to their car. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. My phone buzzed, dispatch asking why I hadn't checked in. I ignored it. The next morning, I quit. To this day, I don't know what those men wanted, but sometimes when I'm driving alone at night, I still catch myself checking the mirror, just in case. I really should have just stayed at Ray's place that night. He lived way out in the country, in one of those spots where your phone barely gets a signal and the nearest neighbor is miles away. But I had work the next morning, and calling out wasn't an option. So even though I was exhausted, I got in my car and started the long drive home. It was sometime after midnight, maybe 1 or 2 a.m., and the road was completely empty. Just me, my headlights, and miles of farmland on both sides. I had the radio playing to keep myself awake, but honestly, I was struggling. Then, out of nowhere, something appeared in my headlights. A suitcase. It was just sitting there, right in the middle of my lane, standing upright like someone had carefully placed it there. I slammed on my brakes harder than I needed to, my heart suddenly pounding from the surprise. For a few seconds, I just stared at it. I was too tired to think straight, but the whole thing felt weird. I wasn't about to get out and move it, though. No way. Instead, I just steered into the other lane and went around it, keeping my eyes on it in the rearview mirror until it disappeared into the darkness. A few minutes later, I saw something else up ahead. This time it was a truck. It was parked right in the middle of the road. No lights on, no blinkers, nothing. If I hadn't had my high beams on, I might not have even seen it in time. I pulled up behind it, waited a few seconds, then honked. No movement. I honked again, longer this time. Still nothing. I looked through, the back window trying to see if anyone was inside, but the truck was pitch dark. No sign of a driver. Carefully, I started to go around it, keeping an eye on it the whole time. That's when I noticed the dents and scratches along the side, big ones like the truck had been through something rough. I couldn't tell if it had been in an accident or if it was just an old beat-up truck, but either way, it gave me a bad feeling, and the fact that no one was inside, that made it worse. I looked around, but all I saw was open farmland. No houses, no gas stations, no reason for someone to just leave their truck sitting in the road like that. I felt uneasy, but I kept driving, trying to shake the feeling, and then just a minute later I saw him. A man stood in the road waving his arms. I hit the brakes again, my stomach twisting. He looked rough, maybe in his 40s, with messy hair and scratches on his arms. His clothes were dirty, like he had been walking for a long time. As soon as my car stopped, he smiled and walked up to my window. "Hey man, did you see a truck back there?" His voice was friendly, but something about the situation felt off. I nodded. "Yeah, I saw it. Think you could give me a ride back to it?" I hesitated. My gut was telling me no, but I didn't want to seem rude. Why is it just sitting in the road like that?" I asked. "What are you doing out here?" For a second, he seemed caught off guard, like he hadn't expected me to ask. Then he said, "Ran out of gas. I was walking to find a station." That didn't make sense. If he was looking for gas, why would he ask me to take him back to the truck instead of further down the road? As he kept talking, trying to fill the silence, I glanced past him, and that's when I saw it. Just beyond the road, barely visible. Through the tall crops was the back end of a car. It was deep in the field, almost completely hidden. Only one taillight was reflecting my headlights. Something was very, very wrong. I rolled up my window. The man's smile instantly vanished. His face twisted in frustration, and he started pounding on the glass, yelling something I couldn't hear. My heart was racing now. I threw the car into drive and hit the gas, speeding away as fast as I could. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my phone and called the cops. When they arrived, the truck was gone, but the car in the field was still there, and inside was a body. It hadn't been an accident. Someone had killed them. The cops figured out that the driver had probably picked up a hitchhiker, the same man I saw, and that was the last thing they ever did. The suitcase, the truck. Maybe they were tricks to get someone to stop, maybe they had nothing to do with it. But one thing was clear, the man in the road wasn't looking for help. He was looking for his next ride, and I almost gave it to him.